Hi, welcome to Mass Media in Society. I'm Professor Marianne Schultz, and this lecture will talk about the book industry. You'll see here that there's 4 learning objectives that you should accomplish by the time that you're done with this module. Books were the first mass medium and are considered the cultural medium because they began not for entertainment but to teach, to document, and to record history. But the modern book industry is a commercial business, yet it still transmits and impacts modern culture. Most major religions are based on a book, and many famous books have shaped and directed American culture. Some have even sparked feverish debate, and others play a role in defining pop culture. What exactly do books do? What was life like before writing, when there was only oral tradition? Can you imagine that? How many of you purchase books besides textbooks? Whether you like to read hardcover books, paperbacks, or even ebooks. I used to use a Kindle, which was a reader, and now I read a lot of things right on my phone. Here's some specific cultural values of books that experts have pulled out. They're agents of change in regards to culture and social aspects. It's where we store things. If you don't believe me, have you ever walked through a library or have you ever checked out the Internet archives? They serve all our needs. Remember, we learned about uses and gratification when we learned about media effects. Books meet our cognitive needs when we want to learn something. They entertain us. We also can use these when we just want to get away, we just want to withdraw. Books are a window on the past. They're also mirrors of culture, whether it's modern culture or culture from the past. They're important sources of personal development. They also are used for individual and personal activities because it allows you to more deeply immerse yourself into a book. How many of you have read a book and you absolutely loved it, and then you saw the film or a television show that was based on that, and you just thought it was absolutely horrible? Because you have your own perception. You used your own imagination in that book. The first writing began as pictographs or drawings on cave walls, and they're still found today. We even have some about 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. The Egyptians used reed pens or pens made from reeds that you pulled out of the swamp, and they wrote on papyrus, which was a pulp based paper. And they also used those to write on anything that you could make an impression on, like stone, metal, clay. The first alphabet to represent sounds wasn't developed until several centuries later, about 1700 BC. When did people start writing on what we would consider paper? Now, first, I want to tell you that paper or parchment paper was made from cellulose fibers that came from trees or plants. Whereas when you hear parchment, that was generally animal skin that was stretched out and dried, and it was usually skin from calves, goats, or sheep. The Chinese started to write on paper about 240 BC, and the Romans preferred to use parchment itself as the paper. If you like art, one of the things I highly recommend is go up and visit the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. There you'll find examples of illuminated manuscripts. These were drawn by monks, or scribes they're also called, and whatever was published was totally controlled by the Roman Catholic Church because they controlled the spread of knowledge. Illuminated manuscripts were first created in the 6th century and then popularized across Europe into the 15th century. They centralized the command of the Middle Ages, and as I said, they were controlled by the church, which was why monks and scribes were the ones that made these. They symbolized a new era of textual literacy, spiritual devotion, as well as material culture. They were handwritten books with painted decoration that generally included precious metals such as gold or silver. The pages were made from parchment, which, as I mentioned before, was animal skin. They were produced between 1100 and 1600 with monasteries as their earliest creators. The decline of the illuminated manuscript tradition coincided with the ability to mass produce printed text, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and the increasing numbers of literate people who wanted secular as well as religious books. I mentioned you can see these in the Getty Museum, and you can also see these at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. In the mid 15th century, we had the first mass produced mass medium, which was books. So when somebody asks you what was the oldest mass medium and how was it developed, you could say that it was from the Gutenberg Revolution. Johannes Gutenberg invented a printing press that he actually made from a wine press. I'm going to show you a video here that's not the Gutenberg press, but it's a representation of kind of how it worked. It used mechanical movable type. In other words, pieces of types that could be formed with letters and you could move things around. You could print one page, which as you'll see in the video is actually 4 pages, and then you could change everything around and print another one. Gutenberg is known as the first publisher of the Bible, which still today is the best-selling book of all time. So as we move forward 100 years later almost, the first printing press was called the Cambridge Press. It was in Massachusetts, and they published mass-produced religious and government documents. The first book that was actually printed other than the Bible was the Book of Psalms, which was printed in 1644. And the first non-secular book or non-religious book wasn't printed until almost 100 years later. And that was Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, which sold 10,000 copies a year. And what that consisted of was short stories, poetry, weather, and facts that farmers used. Today, that's called the Farmer's Almanac. Remember, the earliest colonists came to America primarily for 2 reasons. They wanted to escape religious persecution, and they wanted to find economic opportunities that weren't available to them in Europe. Most of the books they brought with them to the New World were religiously oriented. Moreover, they brought very few books at all. These Europeans were better educated and wealthier and were far more secure at home. Those who were willing to make the dangerous journey across the ocean tended to be poor, uneducated, and largely illiterate. Still, by and large, books were religiously oriented or pertained to official government activities such as tax rolls and the pronouncements of various commissions. In the 1800s, we had 2 major impacts on mass production of books. We had the linotype. Now this used, if you look at the picture here, it had a typewriter type of keyboard, And that allowed what was called mechanical type rather than a manual setting of the individual letters. So they could actually type them out and make those make those press plates right there. Next was offset lithography, which made printing possible from photographic plates rather than the metal casts. What were known as dime novels were actually the first mass medium because they were inexpensive. They also came out right before the breakout of the Civil War. The Beadle brothers, you'll see Beadle, they started selling these popular action novels that were very small. U.S. Popular Fiction issued several series of these. Most of these were about frontier type adventure. Now, when the Civil War broke out, these were extremely popular because they were inexpensive and they could also be read very quickly. So, if a soldier had a little bit of downtime, kind of wanted to get away, here's an example of withdrawal, they would read these dime novels. Remiss a little and go backwards. The book industry didn't develop quickly after the Revolutionary War, which was the late 18th century, because at that time books were still very expensive to make. Literacy was a luxury for those who had wealth. About the time the dime novels came out, we developed what was called, we meaning the United States, developed what was called compulsory education. And it meant you had to go to school. It was required that you become literate. So by the turn of the century or 1900, most states required that children from age 5 and up had to go to school. Now, you didn't have to go to school all the way through high school, but you had to learn to read. Paperback books became popular first in Europe in the middle of the 1930s when Penguin books came out. Then in 1939, we had pocketbooks, which I always assumed pocketbook was what my mother called her purse. But it actually came from these small books. They cost about a quarter. They had already been successful hardbacks or hardback books. They were sold where people gathered. Now, these were before you could go to a bookstore, but perhaps they were sold in the market or they were sold anywhere that people gathered. Today, 60% of all printed books are paperback. When you hear the term censorship in relation to books, it's when someone in authority limits publication of a book or access to it. Now remember, books are targeted because they're so influential as agents of social change, and they're also cultural repositories. So things are stored, they're written down, they don't go away. Book publishers have obligations to resist censorship, and one of the biggest agencies of that is the American Library Association, which I'll talk about a little bit more here. I wrote here, and the U.S. publishers resist censorship by recognizing their obligations to their industry and to themselves. They're fundamental to the operation and maintenance of our democratic society. I want you to remember that it's important for democracy that books are not censored. People should, the librarians here, the ALA, their argument is that, that these are librarians are professionals and should be able to work with parents and work with schools to provide the materials that help children become critical learners and critical thinkers. Why are books censored? Generally, it's political views, race or ethnicity issues, sex. It's too violent, sexuality, and gender issues, family values. I want to show you this list of some of the books that are commonly targeted because when I teach this in person, my students just are appalled and shocked at some of the books that you would never think would be censored. And I'm just going to let you go through some of this and I'm going to scroll through. Captain Underpants was number 2. The Kite Runner. Some of these became major films. 50 Shades of Grey. The Perks of Being a Wallflower, Hunger Games, To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm going to guess most of you read that when you were in school. And some of these, as we go down the list, A Brave New World. Huxley's A Brave New World. I've mentioned that several times. Of Mice and Men, The Handmaid's Tale, one of my favorite television shows on Hulu. But if you go down this, you're going to Goosebumps. How many of you read R.L. Stein's Goosebumps when you were younger? The Bible. You'll notice a lot of these are about sexuality or violence. Catcher in the Rye. The Color Purple is about racism. The Book is Gay is about homosexuality. Things like that. The Diary of Anne Frank. We got where we learned the biographical nature of a young lady who lived in an attic throughout most of the World War II to keep away from the Nazis so that they didn't put her in a concentration camp. So I'll just kind of scroll down through here and you can pause and you can look through here and see what some of these other books are. More than 50 million people came and watched that movie in one night. It's pretty impressive, isn't it? Here's a to know about the textbook industry. Most K through 12 public school books are influenced by what textbooks are used in California and in Texas. However, as different public schools are moving to the Common Core curriculum, schools have more autonomy over the books that they choose. They're not all, they're not all using the same things. What are the best-selling books of all time? Well, the first one is A Tale of Two Cities, and that sold about 200 million copies. That was Charles Dickens. The second is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, sold 150 million. And number 3 is The Little Prince. Now, I know everybody's saying, what about Harry Potter? Harry Potter was considered a series, and that sold more than 325 million copies by 2006. That's the entire series. If you're curious about the best-selling books, go to ranker.com and you can find that list there. Electronic readers first came out in 2004, and the first one was made by Sony. Then next we had the Amazon Kindle Paperwhite, and then the iPad. And those were obviously became very popular. But like us, we live near the ocean. We have swimming pools. As you might have learned, sometimes these electronic devices fall into water and they're dead. They're gone. But Kobo actually made a reader that was waterproof. So it was cool to use it by the pool or if you went to the beach or something like that. Today, something that's very popular is publishing on demand, or POD, and it's generally a form of e-publishing. So here's a kind of a timeline of how it works. So the person that writes it, the author or the publisher, gets sent a digital file. And it could be like an EPUB format, or it could even be a Word file. Then the textbook is processed, the book's printed. Some of these can print up to 300 pages a minute, so they're very, very fast. Then you select the type of binding that you want, and the books are shipped out. I just did this for a professor of mine from Cal State Fullerton, whose 97-year-old father decided that he wanted to write a book about growing up Jewish in New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey. And it was a fascinating book. He'd made it just for his family initially. And I think I published 25 copies for him. And as they distributed it through the family, friends of the family looked at it and asked for a copy. So unfortunately, he passed away the year after that. But by that time, there was over 100 books that had been ordered. And they were all published on demand, POD. Here's some financial benefits for the publisher and the author. The production costs are much lower. You're not required to publish, 3,000 copies of it. You don't need a warehouse to store them. They're printed, they're packaged, they're delivered. There's no remainders, meaning extra books. For example, your bookstore at your college always orders extras. Those are called remainders. And then the publisher agrees to take those back with no restocking charge. There's also large publishers, and then there's very small book publishers. So overall, this is a lower cost for the reader because you're the one that's paying for this book. And that's the last slide in this lecture, but one of the other things I want to talk about that's become very popular, obviously, are ebooks and books that are made with at no fee to the reader. And in education, these are called open educational resources. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide for this, so I'm just going to sort of mention it here. But in my courses I teach, one of the things that I was appalled by were the excessive price of textbooks. So I found that there was people out there who had written books and were offering those via the internet for no cost. And they also had the Creative Commons licensing, which I'll talk about when we talk about media law. But for example, me as a teacher can take a book that someone else has written and I can use it exactly as it was written, or I can add my own material in there. So, but it's free to you as the student. You don't have to pay a fee for a textbook. So thank you for your time, and my next lecture, I believe, will be about the magazine industry.